has a calling to ministry with a concern for helping the Religious Society of Friends become a whole, blessed community. She travels throughout the country and abroad speaking on this topic and leading workshops about racism, focusing on its eradication and the healing of racism's wounds. Vanessa and Donna McDaniel are the authors of Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice. Vanessa is the Friends General Conference's coordinator for the Committee for Nurturing Ministries, focusing on the Racism and Youth Ministries program, as well as a member of the Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting. And I must say that Vanessa and I met, I think, when she worked for Friends World Committee in Philadelphia, but then we had the opportunity to travel together to India. And Vanessa also stayed in our home in London a few times when she was at Britain Yearly Meeting. So she has stayed in our little one-bed flat that it was pretty tiny, but it was wonderful, very, very cozy. And I just want to say that Vanessa is someone who's just really ahead of most of the rest of us. Vanessa started this work a long time ago, really, but I want to say that I appreciate her faithfulness in helping us see another way of being together. So Vanessa, with that, we welcome you, and we're delighted to hear what you have to share with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, friends. I want to thank Gretchen Castle for her introduction, and then also Brown Matun. I'm sorry, I didn't. One of the things that we didn't do was I didn't confirm how you pronounce your last name. So, Brown Mujedi, is that? Okay, thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. I plan to talk with you about community in a way that may be challenging for some. And I'm also going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation that I have put together for you. So I want to begin my talk this evening with a land acknowledgement to honor the tribe that has lived on this land for thousands of years, the Lenni Lenape. Who are they? The English interpretation of Lenni Lenape literally means men of men, but is translated to mean original people. The Lenni Lenape are caretakers of this land called Lenape-Hawking, which, as you see on the map, includes the Philadelphia area where I currently live. They are referred to as the Delaware Indians by the European settlers who forcibly removed the majority of the Lenni Lenape tribe westward or into Canada in the 1700s. I'm going to share with you their standard land acknowledgement written by the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation to honor the Lenni Lenape people and territory preceding events in Lenape-Hawking. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenape-Hawking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another until upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Before we move into the body of my presentation, I would like for us to watch this map depicting the theft of Turtle Island's original indigenous homelands over the current centuries from 1776 to the present. Then let us sit in silence for a few minutes and feel the loss of the indigenous population of Turtle Island. I should say that there is no audio for this video. It is silent. Thank you, everyone. I want to state that I will be using several terms interchangeably tonight as a way to identify non-white people. You may be more familiar with some of these terms I will be using than others. These terms are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, BIPOC, people of color, and people from the global majority. According to an article in the June 18th, 2014 issue of the Huffington Post, Friends focus heavily on individual connections to the higher power, and we also value the power of the gathered community. The Huffington Post also said, Quakers rely on unity and trust within our communities, both inside and outside the meeting house, which helps us to create open-minded conversation and cooperation. The Quaker Information Center, maintained by Earlham School of Religion, describes Quakers as an active, involved, faith-based community living in the modern world. We are a diverse people consisting of several distinct branches. We continue our traditional testimonies of pacifism, social equality, integrity, and simplicity, which we interpret and express in a variety of ways. Today, many friends include stewardship of our planet as one of our testimonies. As friends, we believe that every person is loved and guided by God or a divine presence. Broadly speaking, we affirm that there is that of God in everyone. Everyone is known by God and can know God in a direct relationship. We are called to attend to this relationship, to be guided by it, and use this relationship to help us create a community open to all, one where everyone is and feels valued. Over many years as a member of the Religious Society of Friends, I have heard many friends express how they have felt either included or excluded in their monthly and or yearly meetings. Some have felt loved and supported by their yearly meeting, while others felt isolated, uncomfortable, and overwhelmed. As a child, I was surrounded by Quakers. Members of the Religious Society of Friends were in my schools, neighborhood, and connected to my family's church. My first exposure to meeting for worship was when my Quaker friend, an elementary school classmate, invited me to attend her summer camp, Camp Darkwaters in Medford, New Jersey. As a student at Westtown School, I felt called to join the religion. I did not because I thought it was only populated by people of European descent, and I was not willing to continue to isolate myself in that manner. Despite being surrounded by friends, it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I joined the Religious Society of Friends. I joined Friends because I was older and able to see that the values I was raised with and believed in were embedded in Quakerism. I felt it was important for me to become a member to truly be a part of the community. I needed to make a commitment to Friends, so I did, despite the fact that only a handful of them looked like me. My son was raised as a Quaker, but left Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting and joined an African-American megachurch, Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Both our daughters were also raised in the Religious Society of Friends. They too left Quakerism like their brother. During Friend General Conferences pre-gathering and other retreats, several African-American friends told me that they no longer attend their meetings because they could not tolerate the racism they experience on a weekly basis. Unlike my children, they have affirmed their commitment to the Religious Society of Friends, just not their Quaker meeting. Sadly, they are in areas of the country where there's only one meeting in their geographical area. They do not have the ability to attend a different meeting as I do in Philadelphia, where we have 8 meetings and 2 worship groups in the city. One of the meetings is a predominantly African-American hybrid and held at Ujima Friends Peace Center, located in the ghetto of North Philadelphia. Ujima is a program of the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent, which grew out of the commitment made by the fellowship in 2016 to address the causes and consequences of state-sanctioned violence on a local level. In the January 2003 issue of the Friends Bulletin, Amhara Powell, a former member of Orange Grove, Pasadena, California monthly meeting, shared her experience of finding friends and then losing her identity as an African-American in Quakerism. She said, "Unprogrammed worship spoke to my condition like no prior religious practice. I thought of myself as having always been a Quaker without ever having known it. I did not feel the dearth of persons of color in meeting was having any particular effect on my spiritual life. I was subconsciously experiencing a degree of alienation. Then 2 African Americans visited my meeting on separate occasions. I realized that I was missing the presence of African Americans as a regular part of my religious experience. I wondered if my commitment to Quakerism had come at the price of ethnic isolation. I wondered if my African American spirituality was somehow inherently incompatible with unprogrammed Quaker worship. When I joined the Religious Society of Friends, I had sensed early on some level, my African American culture might be put at risk, not by any religious tenets of Quakerism, but rather by certain of its cultural expectations and assumptions. One of the ways Friends General Conference is supporting friends from the global majority is to provide virtual and hybrid programming, which significantly increased during the pandemic. FGC offers weekly and monthly virtual worship, bi-weekly virtual worship sharing, a bi-weekly virtual open house, and both hybrid and virtual retreats specifically for BIPOC to have an opportunity to experience being in an environment where we can be together as a group and specifically are in the majority. In addition to these programs for people of color, Friends General Conference also provides grants for members of its constituent monthly and yearly meetings to attend any of our programming. The Baird Rustin Fund assists with travel fees, and the Mahala Ashley Dickerson Fund helps defray the cost of program registration. Mahala Ashley Dickerson was an African-American attorney who was admitted to the bars of Alabama, Indiana, and Alaska in the 1950s. She was often the first African-American woman to be admitted to these institutions and was a founding member of Alaska Friends Conference. She stated her experience with the Religious Society of Friends in her autobiography titled "Delayed Justice for Sale." She stated, "My attraction to Quakerism was largely on its simplicity and what I have perceived as its sincerity, although years of worship in various Quaker settings taught me that it too has blind spots." Some of you know I am the co-author with Donna McDaniel of Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice. I agreed to write the book because I wanted to know the full story of the relationship between African Americans and friends of both African and European descent. I needed to understand why I and others were experiencing racism within Quakerism. It was the last place I expected to experience it, given the history I had been taught about the special relationship between African Americans and Quakers. Knowing the complexity of the relationship as a result of our years of research has been so helpful for me. If you have not read the book, I encourage you to do so. How many people of the global majority are members of the Religious Society of Friends? First, we do not know because as a religious society, we practice colorblind behavior. Our membership statistics do not include race and ethnicity numbers. Friends General Conference is inviting monthly and yearly meetings to join us in changing this practice. We are asking friends to begin documenting our demographic data in a way that we know the race, ethnicity, age, and gender of our membership. Baltimore Yearly Meeting has begun this process. Their growing diverse leadership committee states on their website, the GDLC is requesting information about current demographics of the yearly meeting so that we can know more about our current community and chart change. To that end, the annual community statistics report now asks for information about age and racial ethnic identity. As BYM commits to taking on increasing participation of young adults and people of color, it is important for us to have ways to recognize the demographics of our current community and to assess how that changes over time. This survey is one, though certainly not the only method we will use to do this. The process of collecting this data also allows us to have important conversation about how we identify and how we form and express community. Living our Quaker testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality/equity, and stewardship as individuals and meetings binds us as a religious community. These values drew me into the Religious Society of Friends. Those ideals have attracted many others to join, but our failure as a society to live into them have caused many people to leave Quakerism hurt and disillusioned. Enacting our testimony of equality, to which I like to add equity, has been slow. Why is that? What are the barriers that keep us from seeing and acting on the truth? I don't have the time to share a detailed response to my question here tonight. So again, I encourage you to read our book, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice. I will say that race is one of the barriers. Race was socially and politically constructed to establish the inherent inferiority of non-white people. It is one of the many systems that has been put into place by our ancestors that serve the function of making it difficult for us to establish and maintain community. These systems were created by and for the benefit of able-bodied Christian, European, heterosexual, land-owning men. They were not meant to support me as an African-American, cisgender, heterosexual female. So what are some of the other systems that were put into place centuries ago that we maintain today? The first one I want to share with you is European American norms. American whiteness is essentially an English creation arising in response to migration, encounter, and a need to sustain established social structures in a new environment. English culture, religious, and political values shaped it, and English travel narratives, journals, histories, and narratives of crime and captivity provide the most extensive formal record of its representations. In these writings, an evolution is evident from documents that colonize an area through the written word to documents that reflect an English community increasingly defining itself in terms of other races, to documents that begin to fix racial types. Able-bodiedness, Christianity, gender, heterosexuality, land ownership, and whiteness are the default settings as human and normative for American culture. Our culture is made up of common assumptions, practices, and attitudes that are embedded in religious, political, economic, and social institutions. Whiteness regulates gender and sexuality. Whiteness is an essential normative cultural structure that impacts all aspects of social relations, including understandings of gender and sexual binaries. Feminist scholars have pointed to ways that explore whiteness as a social location, expressing cultural dominance in human relationships. What do I mean by that? African Americans were allowed to become members in the 1790s of the Religious Society of Friends. Where are they? I'm used to being invisible in this country because whiteness is the norm. Think about all of the images, movies, books, television, and video programs that surround you on a daily basis. How far do you need to search to find a European American featured in any of those items? Whiteness is a function also of capitalism, used to maintain a status quo of social hierarchies, ensuring that whites continue to accumulate wealth quite literally on the backs of people of color. It ensures that a set of unearned but real financial and social privileges are maintained for whites at the expense of others through limiting access to education, housing, banking, property ownership, capital, also money, and employment. What are some of these assumptions that are a part of our national culture that are reflected in our personal beliefs and institutions? I will share 3 of them with you. The first is personal responsibility and individualism. The belief that people control their fates regardless of social position, and that individual behaviors and choices determine material outcomes. The second is meritocracy, the belief that resources and opportunities are distributed according to individual talent and effort, and that social factors such as access to inside information or powerful social networks do not play a significant role. The third one I will share with you tonight is equal opportunity. The belief that arenas such as employment, education, and wealth accumulation are level playing fields, and that race is no longer a barrier to progress in these areas. Why am I sharing this information with you? And what does it have to do with me? Everything. These assumptions and norms affect me on a daily basis. Honestly, there are so many assumptions that regardless of how hard I try, I will never meet them. Why? Because, as I said before, I am an African American, middle class, Quaker, heterosexual, cisgender woman. For some of you, I know what I have just shared is a lot for you to digest. However, I want to take this one step further. I want to talk about white supremacy, what it is, and how it has affected my life. I will start with defining what I mean by white supremacy to give us a common definition to help reduce the barriers I know are challenging my communication with you. When I use the term white supremacy, I am talking about a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and people of color by white peoples and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. White supremacy is embedded in the normal routines of our private lives in our public institutions through structural racism. As a society, we more or less take for granted a context of white male, heterosexual, able-bodiedness, leadership, dominance, and privilege. This dominant consensus on race is the frame that shapes attitudes and judgments about social issues. It has come about as a result of the way historically accumulated white privilege, national values, and contemporary cultures have interacted to preserve the gaps between white Americans and Americans of color. I will share a short video created by ABC7 News Bay Area that addresses the terms structural, institutional, and systemic racism.
Structural, institutional, and systemic racism broadly refer to the system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage racial minorities and particularly Black people. It refers to the rules, practices, and customs once rooted in law with residual effects that reverberate throughout society, each with their own nuances. A good example of systemic racism is redlining, a system once used by banks and the real estate industry that literally outlined the neighborhoods where people of color lived in red ink. If you lived inside of the red lines, loans were considered risky and banks were less likely to give loans or even invest. The practice was banned in 1968, but the impacts live on, preventing Black families from amassing wealth at the same rate as their white neighbors on the other side of that red line. Need proof? According to the Federal Reserve, the net worth of a typical white family is $171,000. That's 10 times greater than that of a Black family. Homes in Black neighborhoods are generally and historically worth less than white homes because the developers and businesses that make a neighborhood, well, a neighborhood, are less likely to be there. That means the tax base is lower too, which has a trickle-down effect. Less tax dollars for schools means fewer kindergarten classes, fewer qualified teachers, fewer AP classes. That leads to lower graduation rates from high school and even fewer graduates from college. This is in part caused by the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately impacts people of color. Institutional racism is more narrowly defined as the overt and covert forces blocking people of color from accessing the same opportunities as white people. Many of these children may benefit from additional educational and counseling services. Instead of getting the help they need, they're isolated, punished, or incarcerated. Once you have a criminal record, it invades all aspects of your life. Getting everything from a job to an apartment becomes that more difficult. Many people believe their communities are over-policed, presumed to be overly dangerous, but consider this. Black and brown people account for 30% of the U.S. population, but account for 43% of people killed by police and more than half of the incarcerated population. Institutional racism goes beyond just serving time. Something as simple as hair can be used to discriminate. Rules at school and the workplace that don't allow for dreadlocks, cornrows, and braids, they discriminate and don't take into consideration hair texture and singles out people based on their physical traits, creating rules where rules aren't needed, rules that control people of color. So, who gets to make all of these rules in society? Since America was colonized, it's been white people who've made these rules. First with slavery, then Jim Crow laws, and separate but equal rules, and even creating limits on who can immigrate into the country. The term given to define that power, white privilege. It refers to whites' historical and contemporary advantages in access to quality education, decent jobs, a livable wage, home ownership, retirement benefits, and wealth, regardless of socioeconomic status.
The structural racism lens helps us to see that individual responsibility alone is no substitute for the pathways of opportunity that only our political, economic, and educational systems can provide. It highlights how our nation's core values and the public policies and institutional practices that are built on them perpetuate social stratifications and outcomes that all too often reflect racial group sorting rather than individual merit and effort. Structural racism is not meant to excuse individual responsibility. It identifies how much harder it is for people of color to profit in ways that most whites can take for granted. Structural racism is a system for allocating social privilege that affects everyone in our society. It describes the ways in which history, ideology, public policies, institutional practices, and culture interact to maintain a racial hierarchy that allows the privileges associated with whiteness and the disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. How does culture interact with structural racism? Culture consists of concepts, values, and assumptions about life that guide behavior and are widely shared by people. These are transmitted generation to generation, rarely with explicit instructions, by parents, teachers, religious figures, and other respected elders. Complicity, also a component of structural racism, occurs when a group of folks refuse to identify, interrogate, hold, and then deconstruct their own collusion in upholding a system. Then we add trauma. We live in a world filled with traumatized people. I will define trauma as a tool of safety and survival, the body's protective response to an event or series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous, usually resulting in a fight, flight, or freeze response. We all have been traumatized in some form by the system of white supremacy. We have many examples of the trauma which is happening in the world today. Some of them are the COVID pandemic that has caused millions of deaths, COVID's continued effect on our lifestyles, the January 6th insurrection, government-sanctioned violence against people of color through the killing of unarmed people of African descent, our zero-tolerance immigration policy, which detains migrant families, separating children from their parents, mass shootings in our schools and other social settings, militarism, and many others. We often talk about the trauma being experienced by people of color, but what about white trauma? It is impossible to be complicit with centuries of traumatizing oppression without being traumatized oneself. You will see a quote on this slide by Resmaa Menakem, who in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies states, all our trauma has been carried generation after generation. Scientists have found that trauma can damage the genes in our cells, which passes down from parent to child. Throughout America's history, people of European descent have colonized, oppressed, and murdered people of color. This is why history matters, and an awareness of it puts our lives into context. A disdain for history sets us adrift and makes us victims of ignorance and denial. History lives in and through our bodies right now and in every moment. Our past is not divorced from the present. We cannot fully understand and adequately respond to the racial injustices of the present without understanding racial injustices of the past. Many times, the racial discrimination or exploitation of the present is not a new creation, but rather a redesigned extension of oppressive structures and beliefs in the past. George Erasmus, an Aboriginal advocate, political leader, and well-respected spokesperson for Indigenous people in Canada, says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. Mark Charles, a theologian, speaker, and writer of Navajo heritage, stated, European immigrants and their descendants have one memory, a romanticized memory of God-ordained discovery and conquest, empty lands, cheap labor, manifest destiny, and exceptionalism. While minorities, including Native Americans and African Americans, have a very different historical and lived experience, which includes stolen lands, slavery, genocide, broken treaties, segregation, mass incarceration, boarding schools, and systemic dehumanization. There is so much that the majority of our citizens have never been told, and it traumatizes them to learn that these exceptional, God-fearing, freedom-loving, justice-seeking nation they were taught about in their classrooms is actually a deeply flawed and systemically racist country. We are traumatized, and we are therefore in denial, acknowledging that our land was stolen from Native people feels like too great a burden. So we create an alternative reality that allows us to disengage emotionally from the truth. The United States of America, this country, and the Religious Society of Friends says that our culture values equality. However, there is a conflict between our behavior and our values. Why have I shared all of this with you? Friends ask me all the time, how can we get more Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, BIPOC, in our meetings? I hear stories about people of color visiting meetings and not staying. Stories of BIPOC members leaving their meetings, feeling frustrated, while the European American members are confused and shocked at their departure. The purpose of my asking you to step out on this ledge with me is for you to be more aware of your internalized white supremacy and privilege by examining your thoughts, words, and actions, and how they might contribute to a system that disadvantages entire groups of people. Dismantling white supremacy and privilege must be done on a personal, political, and institutional level. In 2018, I had the opportunity to attend Britain Yearly Meeting in London. During my time there, I had the gift of attending Dr. Diana Jeter's Salter lecture titled Bearing Witness or Bearing Whiteness. In her lecture, she talked about her experience in Zimbabwe. The part of her lecture that was most amazing to me was her understanding of white supremacy, white culture, and the trauma it has caused both Zimbabweans and Europeans. She gave several examples of how white culture dominated Zimbabwe and the world's understanding of that country. As a result of bearing witness through living and studying in Zimbabwe, she came to understand how white supremacy had been used to center whiteness in that country. She noticed that all of the people who had been considered experts on Zimbabwe were academic scholars, specifically European men. She wondered how they had become experts on the country instead of the native Zimbabweans. Living in Zimbabwe, making friends with Zimbabweans, listening to and valuing what the Zimbabweans told her helped Jeters transform her sight and challenge the narratives of the global North by trying to represent the past in terms that are true to Zimbabwean perspectives. She concluded that by the 1920s, Africans' expertise in their own languages and culture had been usurped by self-referential white linguists and ethnographers, and that archive-oriented historians overestimate how far white missionaries and administrators really understood what Africans said and did. I was so excited to see that Jeter understood whiteness and white supremacy, and to hear her suggest dismantling it by decentering it in Zimbabwe through questioning the expertise of white missionaries and administrators. What did Jeter mean by bare whiteness? Jeter talked about the importance of being the change we want to see. This will be a challenging journey because it will require acknowledging the expertise of the existence of whiteness, admitting the wound that has been resulted from the trauma of creating whiteness on all of us. We have all been complicit in maintaining internalized white dominance and internalized racial oppression in this country. As I said earlier, whiteness is already a part of American culture. It is in the norms we follow, the assumptions we make, the language we speak, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. This is the case no matter the color of our skin. This means we must create new expressions of white culture that call out, reject, and undermine white supremacy. So, if we're going to call out, reject, and undermine white supremacy in our lives and our meetings, we need tools to help us. I want you to begin with this tool. Ask yourself these personal questions. How am I benefiting from privilege? How do I make myself comfortable with privilege? How do I ignore privilege? What am I doing today to address my privilege? How do I fool myself into thinking I am powerless? How does society reinforce my taking myself off the hook? What people do I need to talk to so I can stay on the hook? What education do I need about supremacy, privilege, and their absence? How do I define my moral obligation? Once you have asked yourself these questions and thought about your answers, then I want you to take the following action steps. Develop the habit of entering situations with knowledge that others do not have privilege. Notice differences in treatment. Bring up privilege with others and learn to clearly articulate the experience. Ask people of color about their experience and be willing to accept their experiences as true, real, and accurate. Be willing to teach others and hold them accountable. Practice humility around privilege. Talk about privilege and its effects, even in uncomfortable situations. Some additional actions you can take to help support your growth are: wear something around your wrist as a reminder about your privilege and as a personal commitment to explain why you wear the wristband. Set aside sections of the day to critically examine how privilege is working. Put a note on your mirror or computer screen as a reminder to think about privilege. Make a daily list of the ways privilege played out and steps taken or not taken to address privilege. Find a person of color who is willing to hold you accountable for addressing privilege. Why am I asking you to do these things? As I said earlier, our ancestors have left a system of white supremacy and privilege. It is going to take specific actions on our part to dismantle those systems and to create a more equitable world. Change will come only with deliberate attention and effort. Because the issue is so broad, it is not possible for any individual or any single organization to possess all the capacities and resources needed to achieve racial equity. But here are some key actions that should guide us all. First and foremost, take responsibility for racial, gender, class, sexual, and physical equity. We all must educate ourselves about the ways in which structural racism plays out in our own personal and professional worlds. We must be willing to examine and challenge our own uncritical participation in the system and processes that sustain structural racism. Model racism, gender, class, sexual, and physical equity internally in our own organizations. Seek out resources to guide organizations aiming to improve their ability to address racial issues. Focus on achieving outcomes from all stages of your work that are equitable in terms of race, gender, class, sexuality, and physical ability. Examine your program's impact on reducing these disparities. Emphasize capacity building. Identify key public policies and institutional practices that need reform and develop alliances that have the power to change them. Step outside traditional boundaries to form new relationships with other groups that are concerned about these issues. Educate leadership groups, especially public and private funders, about the value of an anti-racism structural frame. Counter popular assumptions that work to reproduce the status quo in the media, in the community, and in everyday personal life. Get political. Become aware of policies likely to increase racial inequity and get involved in collective efforts to challenge those policies. Carefully scrutinize policies that seem peripheral or even irrelevant to local disparities, as they often have more influence on well-being than we recognize. As you are incorporating these actions into your life, I'm going to ask you to bring them into your monthly, quarterly, and yearly meetings as well. As I said in my 2021 Stephen G. Carey Memorial Lecture titled Radical Transformation, Long Overdue for the Religious Society of Friends, now a Pendle Hill pamphlet, the systems of white supremacy continue to erect walls that prevent people of the global majority from joining and remaining in our Quaker community. In January 2015, at a called meeting of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the body came to unity on the following minute of action. Friends tested and affirmed the work of our clerks and our elders. Since being tasked during annual sessions in July 2014 to help discern a way forward in addressing many isms, including racism, sexism, genderism, and classism. Friends also heartily affirmed that as a yearly meeting, we commit to increase our consciousness as friends about the intersection of privilege and race in our culture and spiritual community. We know our knowledge is often limited by our own experiences and that we have much to learn from each other and from outside sources. Commit to move forward with our entire community. The yearly meeting is the community of all our individual friends and monthly meetings, and this work needs to be done with the involvement of all of us. Commit to integrate this work into what we do in an ongoing way at the yearly meeting level. We want this work to become part of the fabric of what we do whenever we get together as yearly meeting members and attenders. I can tell you that writing and affirming this minute was just the beginning. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting has been working to live into this minute, which has been a difficult, painful, and at times angry-filled process. It has felt like it is tearing our community apart, and in some ways it is. Addressing racism in the Religious Society of Friends is as turbulent as ending enslavement was for our community. In many ways, the seed of enslavement, genocide, and whiteness all came from the tree of white supremacy. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting in this minute is challenging whiteness by stating that it will move as a community, making each individual responsible for the other. This is a practice that Friends have experience with doing, but can take a long time to achieve because it goes against the norms of our culture in the United States. The transformation of sight is often a painful process, just as all true growth is. We are born into a racial hierarchy, and every interaction with media and culture confirms our sense that on a fundamental level, people of European descent are superior and people of color are inferior. Culture shapes the way we order our life, interpret our experiences, and evaluate the behavior of other people. I say again, culture shapes how and what we see, and how and what we see shapes our everyday behaviors and actions. One of the benefits of privilege that comes with white skin in America is being sheltered from having to engage with race-based stress. According to Robin DiAngelo, white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and isolates them from race-based stress. This isolated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what she refers to as white fragility. White people tend to confuse comfort with safety, but it is rare that these situations are actually unsafe. They're uncomfortable because we aren't accustomed to that level of discourse. When you engage with difficult topics, as we are doing right now, you develop a more muscular approach to staying engaged. Hill continues, and an increased understanding of our present and of our history ushers in new levels of discomfort. Learning to respond in a healthy way to the internal chaos aroused by our awakening is an important step forward. American culture tends to hide the stories of guilt and shame and seeks to elevate stories of success, which result in the amnesia about a tainted history. This practice is exactly why Donna McDaniel and I decided to research and write Fit for Freedom. We wanted to disrupt our normal white culture by presenting a publication that shared the full history of the relationship between Quakerism and African Americans with all of its complexity. I'm thankful for the opportunity to dispel the myths generated about this relationship. However, I knew that Fit for Freedom was going to be a difficult book for some friends to read. The information we were discovering was hard for me to digest as an African American, yet it explained so much. I wondered if European American friends would retreat into their white fragility, or would they be resilient? I can say that more friends were resilient than I expected. As a person of color in the Religious Society of Friends, I need you to be resilient, to walk alongside those of us of color who have no choice but to move forward and to stick to the hard work of separating whiteness from white supremacy. The resilient person not only recovers from disruption, but persists through it. I want you to have the vision to see things differently. Be open to listening in new ways and understand things outside of the context of white culture. Your goal should prioritize flexibility. Step outside of your white cultural boundaries. Test yourself constantly to see how flexible you truly are. When you feel your white fragility surfacing, notice it. Let it pass through you and take the risk of making a different choice. Instead of defending your intention, apologize. Let go of your defensiveness and focus on how your actions have impacted others, regardless of how good your intentions were. We have the power to remove the barriers, European American norms, which will bring a messiness, also fear and anxiety to our meetings that will feel uncomfortable for many. Messiness is good for our communities. It strengthens our flexibility by promoting change and helping us review and remove the systems and practices that no longer serve us well. We need a vessel to hold this messiness. It will be important for us to establish and adhere to our own community guidelines before we begin this process. These guidelines will support us as we work to establish systems that allow many of us who currently feel excluded to begin to have a place in our community. These guidelines will be something that we will co-create and co-own as a community together. Friends of color within the Friends General Conference community developed guidelines for our community that we use regularly. These guidelines have supported us at times when difficulties arise by providing a clear, transparent, and visible understanding of what we expect from the members of our community. I want to acknowledge that there will be some people who will not want to be a part of our community, and that is fine. Our journey towards transformation will have periods of turbulence. I want you to see these times as growing pains. In order for us to grow, it will require the involvement of our entire community. It is important for everyone to be visible and to have a voice. Living into our testimonies will serve us well during this time. I leave you tonight hoping that you will join me in removing barriers, especially including the fear to embrace each other, listen, be led in unexpected ways, develop relationships with one another and God or Spirit, as well as be willing to be changed so that we can build the supportive, inclusive community that we are seeking. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you for that presentation.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna just jump straight into a Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand, use your raise hand button, and I will unmute you, and then, or you can unmute yourself. I'll just call out on you. And free to just say thank you if you don't have a question. It's also important. The other note I need to make is please make your questions or observation as brief as you can so that we can accommodate as many people on this call as we can. Steve.
Vanessa, I've heard, well, I wonder about this presentation you've just given, which is, I compliment you. It's comprehensive. It walked me step by step through many things I wanted to know. It gave me a large overview of where I might want to go next, so forth. I can only imagine it would be of benefit disseminated broadly. And are you available, my question, to make this same presentation at yearly meetings this summer?
Thank you, Steve. So it depends on the yearly meeting and when it is occurring. As staff for Friends General Conference, there are some commitments that I already have made for this coming summer. So if there are yearly meetings that are interested in having me come and give this same presentation, then they should get in touch with me by sending in an email to Vanessa J at fgcquaker.org. And we will see what we can, if it's possible to arrange things given the other commitments I currently have.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Diane.
Hi, sorry, I'm so dark there. I often am trying to translate things into something more concrete, and I wondered if you would be able to give us an example of some sort of systemic racism that you might see in a monthly meeting.
There are many examples, and I'm just trying to decide which one to share with you. So I know that there is a person that came to our meeting, and this is a person of color, and that they, during the social hour afterwards, no one spoke with them. And I was observant and watching what was happening. So I went over and started talking with them. But, part of what happens during our social hours is that people are going around taking care of business and talking to the person that they need to talk to about this committee event or that, or maybe catching up with friends and not always looking and seeing who is around and not necessarily engaged with the meeting and have a conversation with them. So I actually, before COVID, because I haven't been attending my meeting in person since then, is that I would always make it a practice of making sure, actually right after, at the rise of meeting, going over to any people of color who were new that had come to worship, and talking with them, introducing myself, welcoming them. So that's an example that I have to share with you. And actually want to ask if there are any other folks here who are people from the global majority who would like to share maybe an experience that you've had or someone that you know have had in your meetings.
Kayla?
Yes, the example that came to my mind is there was a point at which, in trying to be conscientious and purposeful about making change, we have determined in our meeting that one of the things we'll attempt to do is that when we need work done around the meeting house, that we would try to make a point to hire people of color to try to make up for past negligence. But it was just a very small piece of what our meeting was wanting to do to begin to change the paradigm. Fast forward, we needed to get some groundwork done, some yard work and things done on the outside. And one of our members wanted to donate, who's got a business and he's got a company that does his landscaping. And he was willing to and offering to donate to the meeting house his landscaping person to do the work. But of course, again, what we had said we would do is to try to find minority businesses. So his commentary was, I'm happy to pay for this, but my landscapers, well, they may not meet the definition that we've set. However, he has tattoos all over him, so I imagine that makes him different or a minority or something to that effect. Needless to say, I was livid. And no one in the meeting said anything. Nor did I at that time. But the same person said the same thing at a different time, who knows how many months later. And again, no one said anything. It happened the third time, and the third time I spoke up. I just couldn't bear it anymore. And I made the point, because I honestly believe you take advantage of teachable moments. So the issue was not to embarrass him or to out him, but it certainly was, in my mind, a teachable moment, especially since no one else apparently was hearing this. And I couldn't figure out what it was, why it was people weren't hearing it. Anyway, so I made the comment. No one else said anything, but later on I got this very interesting note from this person that was put in the mail to me about how he didn't appreciate while it was okay for me to make that point to him, he didn't appreciate the fact that I did it publicly. And that's my story about racism and how you see it playing out in a meeting. And I've been with this meeting for well over 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Sure.
Gretchen?
Well, I'm just going to take a bit of a risk here and make myself a bit vulnerable by saying something that I've done twice very memorably and that I've been embarrassed about. And that is they were the same thing. That is, when I was working with someone and I was just aware of and heard this person's story about difficult racial experience of racism. And both times I said, you know, can you teach me? And my intention was there, but as soon as I said it, both times I was so clear that that was just the wrong thing to say. And that it's because it's not his responsibility to teach me. It's my own responsibility to really learn what I need to learn. And I don't know if that makes sense to people, but both times I really felt, you know, upset with myself. I thought, no, that's not what this is about. It's about learning it myself. And I appreciate all that you've given us, Vanessa, and especially a lot of actions that we can take and just new awareness that, you know, make the most of these teachable moments, as Sheila said. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm grateful actually I think the pandemic has helped a lot of us look at our own lives and our own complicity in new ways. So I appreciate, you know, more awareness, more ease talking about this, and really working on for myself in you know, in thinking about my own complicity. Thanks, Vanessa.
Viv. Is it Vivian or Viv and Lola?
Yes, hello. Vanessa, thank you so much for the depth of your delivery, for so much of what you included there. And this may be a question that you'd rather pass on, which I would wholly honor. I hear you talking about the possibility. What if we don't meet that possibility? What do you see being the consequences for the Religious Society of Friends?
Separation, so that their friends of color, you know, several of us, I included, are clear that I'm a Quaker, and it just means that, you know, there may be an people of color branch of Quakerism, like there are in other religious congregations and communities.
Sheila is the hand.
Yes, and I realize I'm speaking twice, and this will be my last time, but I did just want to say to Gretchen, because I do appreciate her speaking up, but to let her know that what she said is very common, very offensive, but also very common. I'm always hearing, teach me. And my reaction to that is, and Gretchen, I don't mean this negatively, but when people say that, to me, what I'm really hearing is that whole white privilege, oh God, it's like, you don't need to be taught anything. We are who you are. We are the same as you are. When something offensive happens to you, you're hurt, you're offended. We're the same way. There's nothing to be taught other than opening your mind to recognizing and accepting the people that you're referencing or talking about are the same exact as you are in every sense of the term, except for their skin color. Every sense of the term. two other things, just two other examples of things that happened to me, and I'm really done. Once there was a guy who said to me, we were getting ready for a Quaker market and we were gathering things and storing things, and it was cold outside, and we were bringing things from inside and putting it in a storage area at the outside. So I was moving quickly because I'm not a cold weather person. And this guy walked by me and said, whoa, slow down. We're not picking cotton. Well, I was speechless. The last thing, and not the last thing, but the last thing I'm going to mention here that happened to me is someone coming up to me, someone whom I knew and whom I like and felt very good about. And I'm sure that I mean, we had a nice friendly relationship. And she walked up to me and put her hand in my face and said, your skin is just so beautiful. And I'm thinking, walks up to someone else and puts their hands in their face. It's so offensive. It's so going and intruding oneself into my boundaries. We don't do that in our society, except that if somehow you see me being so different from you that you think that's okay.
Thanks, Sheila. I also want to expand on that. Is that a part of why for me is offensive when people come and touch your hair or touch your face or your body, who are people that, you know, are not family members or close friends. It is as a person, that's a part of the privilege and that is inherent in our society, that as a white person, that I'm property and you can do whatever you want to me. You don't need my permission.
Yeah, it's what we do with our pets all the time. We do it with our pets.
Yes. And I've had those experiences as well. And I know that it is done in a way that is not meant to be harmful and upsetting, but it is. So, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Chuck?
Vanessa, is it okay if I say something from your support committee?
Sure.
So one way, I've been on Vanessa's support committee at our Quaker meeting for a long time. And Vanessa brings many invitations that she gets to come and speak, which are great things, but oftentimes Quakers are very cheap. They aren't actually thinking about Vanessa at all. They want to be educated by her. And they're waiting for her to come bring the truth to them. And she does bring the truth very fully. And she's smart sometimes to take someone along with her who's white to accompany her to meet with white folks with the questions they have. But one of the things that doesn't happen is that people often don't offer to compensate her for her time and her efforts in coming. So her ministry is often kind of searching for ways to get funds to actually do the work that she wants to do. And it's a way that Quakers are always evaluating, is this worth my while? Is this not worth my while? And in this case, I think it's a direct kind of way that racism comes at people of color who take the kind of amazing stance of saying, I am willing to go anywhere to speak truth, the truth as I see it, that comes to me through God. So I just encourage us to kind of think about that as we go forward and offer invitations to not have the expectation of being taught.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you so much for raising that. Got it.
All right. Hello. So I am not a Quaker, and my familiarity with the Society of Friends is as new as my employment at Earlham College, so since October of 2021. And I'm very curious about whether you or anyone else here can talk about the cultural norms within the Society of Friends that Black people might find, I'll use the word different when encountering worship among friends.
Thank you for the question. So there are several, and some of it depends on actually what branch. And being that you're in Indiana, you have several branches available to you to attend and participate in. One of the things that in unprogrammed worship that is loved to be touted is, oh, there's no music, which is not actually always true. There are times when people give ministry that I've experienced. I've been both singing and some also with folks dancing. But some of the practices, emotion is something that is not appreciated within Quakerism. And so, I've had experiences when emotions rise, then a lot of times it is the practice is to have everybody settle down and be silent and to worship, to get past the emotion, instead of accepting and going through the emotion and hearing and understanding where it's coming from. So for me, that's one of the things that as a non-Quaker and as someone who appears to be of African descent, that you would experience. So that I know that there have been times also when sometimes I've been with other friends of color and we've been having a good time and have been informed we were being too loud. So that also has been an issue that at times have come up. So right now, those are the two things that I can come up with off of the top of my head. And I invite others, if there are things that you can think of and bring forward, that would be great. So.
Thank you.
Regina?
So I actually wanted to speak to a comment that was in chat where I believe it's Steve or Stephen who said that he had some problem with Vanessa's comment as far as how it had to deal with welcoming and what that had to do with white supremacy. So I just wanted to add to that a little bit. So I'm in Colorado at the present moment. And at this particular meeting, the very first time I visited this meeting, a white woman did welcome me, and she chose to welcome me by saying, hello, I just need you to know that I sleep with a Black man every night. And she was referring to her husband, but I didn't know her or her husband or anything else. That's how she chose to welcome me, was to let me know that she slept with a Black man every night. So that's one instance. I'm sure she would not have welcomed a white visitor that way. I did not go back to that particular meeting for at least 6 months. When I did return, I overheard 2 women in the kitchen talking about me because they were concerned, because they wanted to make sure that I understood that there was no music, again, to the point about music. You know, it's like, well, who's going to tell her that there's no singing and there's no music here? And this was after worship, by the way. And I had been a friend for several years. They assumed I was new to Quakers, even though I was just new to that particular meeting because I had moved to Colorado. And so part of it is not just welcoming friends of color or people of color to a meeting, but how they choose to use business and taking care of business as a way to avoid welcoming people because it's just built into the structures, but how they choose not to welcome people of color when they would welcome a white person to the meeting. So that's in response to what I saw in chat. And as far as to the cultural norms, there are just so many. And again, it does depend on which brand of Quakerism. I became a Quaker actually in Botswana, not in the United States. So coming to the States was a different thing altogether for me because white friends are different in many, many ways. But the idea of not talking about things and talking around the subject and using euphemisms as far as that's not how Quakers do things is one cultural norm that is very prevalent among friends here. It's like, that's not how Quakers do things, when they mean that that's not how their meeting does things, because they're not even familiar with things outside of their meeting, let alone other Quaker traditions outside of their own. But that's something that happens quite often as well.
Thank you for naming that.
I have seen both of the most recent shares happen. I also wanted to say that in our meeting, we had the opposite experience where if we have a new person of color, we kind of mob them, which is also really difficult for the person. And I wanted to make that point because of the other example, that friends need to reflect and say, how would I welcome someone who was like me, so that they don't mob somebody or ignore somebody, but do it normally. It's like it's already been shared. We're all the same, except for Erskine, but where our experiences are very different. And the other thing that came to mind right away was actually when I heard Vanessa speak one time, and she did what she did just now, which was invite questions. And she's the expert. She's come to share and has incredible knowledge and wisdom. And the first person who raised their hand was a white male. And he proceeded to tell us all about some things that he knew about. And I'm afraid I failed to correct him afterwards. Well, come up to him afterwards. He needed to be asked if he would have done that to a white male speaker, because it was very uncomfortable and obviously inappropriate.
Yeah. Elaine?
There's a wonderful video by Aisha Imani, who is one of the mainstays of the Ujima Peace Center. And she says that she has noticed in Quaker meetings in her experience that you can stand and speak, but please speak in standard English and complete sentences. I took that to mean that the cerebral intellectual nature of vocal ministry fits the culture that is cerebral and intellectual. And I am that way. I like to study. I have an intellectual side to myself. And when I really came to terms with that, I really stopped speaking. I'm not sure I'm able to speak to that group of people in a natural way that doesn't end up being cerebral and intellectual. And when I'm very relaxed with a group of people, and I'm myself, I speak differently. I can't be that way in meeting. I don't have the ability. And I think that if any group has a certain dialect and they do code switching, or they have a way of signaling to each other that they're at peace, I respect that, but I don't want the fact that I'm there to make them not able to signal to each other and to others through their own speech patterns that they're at peace and at ease, and that they feel that way with God or with their spiritual life or with that of God or whatever it is. So I'm just stymied. I just wait for something different.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat from Della. I don't know if Della is here. If you want to voice that a little bit for people to know what she's talking about, and then I'll invite Gretchen to close this for us. Della? I think she left. So I want to thank all of you for coming, but more specifically, I want to thank Vanessa for being here. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your time and for your expertise and for the presentation. Thank you for the sacrifices. I know that a lot is happening for you, but you still are here. Thank you for doing this. We truly, truly appreciate it. For those of us who've been following these lectures, you know that the last one is happening next Tuesday. Please tune in, watch out for my email and the Zoom links. Let's finish this series together. I said from the beginning that you now are like my family. Every day I look at my register and mark those who are here. And there will be a recording for this will come out tomorrow. Gretchen.
Thank you, Brown. If it's okay with friends gathered, I'd like to offer a prayer. So let us pray. Oh, gracious God, we thank you for the truth-telling, for the integrity that Vanessa brings to us. We are humbled and grateful and happy to be standing with her, to be in company with Vanessa and all she brings. I ask you, oh God, to be with her brother who's in hospital and to give him care and love and to help the family gather around him. I ask you, oh God, for strength as we come to the edge in various ways, that we make ourselves vulnerable and able and resilient, able to see and hear and know the truth within us as we meet face to face with human beings in the kindest ways possible. Thank you, oh God, for our resilience to be disruptive, to be uncomfortable, to walk alongside, and most importantly, to love one another as Jesus taught us to do. And so for all these gifts we've received and for our lives, for our engagement, for our human capacity, and for our spiritual depth, we say thank you and thank you and thank you. Amen.
Amen.
I just like to say this is Yoko from Vanessa's meeting, and I just love her. And I think all of us really, really love her. And she's just a loving person. And I don't know what to say. I just want to hug her right now. Anyway, that's me. Thank you.